Today's lesson is The Real Lord of the Flies is a tale of people at their best. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And today we're going to talk about the real Lord of the Flies. Last time, of course, we summarized the 1954 novel by the English novelist Sir William Golding, which had a kind of bad ending, a sad ending there. The boys that were stranded on a desert island basically destroyed each other. They couldn't get along, and by the time they were rescued, it was a disaster. But now we're going to talk about a real story that did not have an ending like that.
That's right. Now we're going to look at a story, and the reason why it's called The Real Lord of the Flies is that it's referring to a real event that happened back in 1966 about a group of teen boys that were in a very similar situation. They were stuck on a desert island. They were left on their own, but the result was very different. They actually came out of the situation healthy, happy, thriving, and this incident actually puts a new light on the novel.
It certainly does. So, yes, we'll find out what happens with these boys from Tonga, and let's find out what happened to them way back in 1966. So let's enter our lesson. Let's begin our lesson now by listening to the first part, and then we'll come right back.
In 1966, 16 boys from the island nation of Tonga decided one day to take a sailboat out for an adventure at sea. But their adventure turned into a nightmare when a storm struck, breaking the boat's sail and leaving them with no way to control it. For days, they were carried along on ocean currents until they finally came across the small, uninhabited island of Ata.
各位好，第一部分我们看到单字 uninhabited 这个字是形容词，指无人居住的、杳无人迹的。例如 A fisherman and his son were shipwrecked on an inhabited island. 一名渔夫及其子因撞上一座无人岛而发生船难。另外补充两个相关单字。第一 unoccupied 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 指闲置的、无人使用的，像是Many of the apartments in these newly built buildings are unoccupied. 这些新盖的大楼里有许多公寓是闲置的。第二 deserted D-E-S-E-R-T-E-D deserted 指空无一人的、废弃的。我们可以说 Urban explorers like to visit the deserted factory. 城市探险家喜欢造访那座废弃工厂。
And welcome back. So it says here in 1966, 16 boys from the island nation of Tonga decided one day to take a sailboat out for an adventure at sea. So we have these 6 teenage boys. They're from the island nation of Tonga, which is out in the Pacific. And one day they decide to have an adventure. So they take a sailboat and they just head out to sea.
Right. A sailboat, of course, is a boat that is powered by the wind. They've got a sail, a piece of cloth sticking up into the air. So they take a trip on a sailboat and they go out to sea for an adventure. Adventure here is a countable noun. You could talk about going out and having a great time, an adventure where you go to places that you've never been to before and you see things you've never seen before. That would be an adventure. Adventure could be a general term as well for going out and doing those things. Yeah, I like adventure. I want my life to be exciting. But if it's an individual trip, then it would be an adventure. So they go out and have this wonderful time out at sea. But their adventure turned into a nightmare when a storm struck, breaking the boat's sail and leaving them with no way to control it. So yes, they were having a great time on this sailboat, but there was this sudden storm and their adventure turned into a nightmare. Here we've got the verb phrase to turn into, which means something changes into something else.
Right. Their adventure turned into or became a nightmare. Now, a nightmare is a bad dream, but it can also refer to a very difficult or very scary situation, and that's exactly what happened to them. I could also say, going back to the word nightmare, for instance, their vacation turned into a nightmare when they lost their passports and they were robbed in the streets. So what was supposed to be fun and exciting and slightly dangerous and slightly risky, which is all about having an adventure, turns into a nightmare, into a very scary and very real situation of danger.
Boy, my first week in the United States was a nightmare. I didn't know anybody. I got robbed. I couldn't find my house, etc., etc. It was a nightmare. And they had this nightmare. Their adventure turned into a nightmare when that storm struck. And the storm was very strong, so it broke the boat's sail. And if you don't have a sail on your boat, you're not going to go anywhere. So they could not control the boat. So for days, they were carried along on ocean currents until they finally came across the small uninhabited island of Ata. So if you're in the ocean, of course, you've got currents, which is where the water is kind of moving inside the ocean. And if you're there on a current or in a current there, it's basically going to take you in a certain direction and you can't control it. You're not just going to sit in one place, you're going to be moving around.
Right. The current in an ocean usually goes in one direction. So if it's strong, it's very difficult to swim or sail against the current. And in this particular case, they were carried along by the ocean current because they lost their sail, so they couldn't control their boat. And so they were sailing and floating in the ocean until they came across, meaning they saw by chance, passed in front of this uninhabited island, an island that didn't have anybody living on it, and the island's name is Ata.
It was uninhabited. Nobody was there. I guess you could also say it was a desert island. So, yeah, what happened to them? Did the same thing happen to them as happened to those boys in the Golding novel? Well, we'll find out. So let's move on now to the next part of our lesson. We will listen to it first.
For 15 months, the teens remained on the island, which luckily provided banana trees, taro, and feral chickens. The boys developed a plan to handle chores in pairs, and twice each day, they gathered to sing and pray. In contrast to the boys in Golding's novel, over the months the boys grew a garden, built a chicken pen, and even made a badminton court. Most significantly, they swore never to argue with each other.
第二部分我们看到名词 taro 意思是芋头。举例来说 My niece said her favorite foods are sweet potato and taro. 我的侄女说她最喜欢的食物是地瓜和芋头。接着我们看到单字 feral 这个字是形容词，指野生的。例如 Mina likes to leave food out for the feral cats in her neighborhood. Mina 喜欢留食物给住家附近的野猫。再来我们看到名词 chore 指日常杂物琐事，作此意时常用复数形。例如 It is important that everyone in the family helps out doing household chores. 家里的每一个人都帮忙做家事是很重要的。或是 I have to finish my chores before I can go out with my friends. 我跟朋友出去前必须先将日常琐事完成。另外，除了上面的意思，这个字还可以指讨厌的工作、困难的工作、苦差事，像是Doing my taxes this year was a real chore because many details in the tax rules needed extra attention. 今年报税正是困难的工作，因为税制里有许多需要特别注意的地方。
And welcome back. So let's dive into the first sentence here. It says, for 15 months, the teens remained on the island, which luckily provided banana trees, taro, and feral chickens. So lucky for the boys, this island did provide food. They were able to eat bananas, and they had taro, and they had chicken that they could kill, slaughter, and eat.
Right, and of course, if you're from Taiwan, you know what taro is. That's 芋头, and that can be quite tasty. And it provides a lot of carbohydrates and maybe some protein. And they've got these wild chickens. If it's feral, it's wild. Generally speaking, though, the word feral does refer to a wild animal. But oftentimes it's a wild animal that used to be tamed, like feral cats, for example. A lot of cats in Taipei here, of course, used to be cats that were taken care of by people. They were pet cats, but then they were released because they were too much of a bother, so they became feral cats. But they're wild, they're running free, they can do whatever they want. So it looks like they had quite a lot of stuff here, bananas and taro and chicken. And the boys developed a plan to handle chores in pairs. Okay, so they agreed to cooperate, and they were there for 15 months. And so they kind of set up a little society here. They would handle the chores in pairs. A pair, of course, is two people. So they would have two people working together to handle those chores. What's a chore, Helen?
Well, a chore is a job, often a boring job that you have to do regularly, maybe every day. If you're talking about home chores, then that might include washing the dishes or taking out the garbage. So on an island, you have chores also because you have to hunt and you have to pluck those chickens and maybe you have to maintain a fire so that ships from afar can see the smoke and realize that there are people on that island. And what's interesting here, the first point of contrast, is that the boys in the real life Lord of the Flies decided to work in pairs. They decided to work together, to cooperate in groups of two. Whereas in the book, the first thing they did was to choose a leader. So that's just one difference right there between the two situations.
Yep, so they did better than those English boys stuck on that island. And they gathered to sing and pray twice each day. That sounds like a lot of fun. They prayed, so I guess they were religious here. And they would also sing together. And if people get together and sing, I think they're going to have some very good vibes with each other.
Right. When you sing, you're communicating with somebody, with the people around you. You're not just singing to yourself, but it's a group activity. So another point of contrast, which is in the novel, the boys would sleep or play, so they would spend time alone and they would be lazy. Here, even when they're not working, they're doing something productive. They're doing something that nourishes the group, that improves group life, and that's praying and singing.
Indeed. So they're working quite well together here. And in contrast to the boys in Golding's novel, over the months, the boys grew a garden, built a chicken pen, and even made a badminton court. That's pretty cool here. So in contrast to, which means at the opposite end of. So you've got the boys in Golding's novel. They weren't able to do too much because they had a lot of infighting there. So in contrast to them, the opposite to the boys in the Golding's novel, the real teens here from Tonga were able to do a lot of things. They were able to accomplish a lot of things that the Goldings boys weren't. They grew a garden, okay? They set up a garden to grow plants, maybe taro and other kinds of fruits and vegetables. They also built a chicken pen. That's kind of like an enclosure for chickens.
Right. So instead of having to run around every day chasing after the chickens, because chickens can actually run pretty fast, they built the chicken pen, which is an enclosure, maybe a small space that's fenced in, where they kept the chickens. So when they wanted to eat a chicken, slaughter it, and pluck it, they would just go to the chicken pen, grab a chicken, and cook it. And a word about the phrase here, in contrast to, which is a very useful phrase when you want to say that something is different from something else, in contrast to something. So you can say something like, in contrast to apples and cherries, mangoes grow in hot climates. In other words, apples and cherries grow in cold climates.
Or I could say, as an example, I really like heavy metal music in contrast to my brother who likes boring old country music. But in this particular case, yes, we have different results from these stories. The boys in the Goldings novel weren't able to do the things things that the South Pacific boys were able to do. The Tonga boys grew a garden, built a chicken pen, and even made a badminton court. And most significantly, they swore never to argue with each other. So here, significantly, that's the most important thing here to remember, is that they just wouldn't argue.
Right. So when you have a list of points or a list of pieces of information and that list ends with most significantly, then you know that the speaker or the writer wants you to know that the point that they're about to make is the most important. So most significantly refers to something that is the most important within the context of the speech or the writing. So for instance, I could also say her grades improved significantly after she began studying seriously. So her grades didn't improve just a little bit. Her grades improved a lot, significantly, after she began studying.
Okay, very good. So yes, these South Pacific Islanders were able to survive quite well, whereas the English boys failed miserably. Okay, let's move on now to the third and final paragraph. We'll listen to it first.
When they were rescued at last, the boys were in excellent physical and mental health despite their long ordeal. As this real-life Lord of the Flies shows, perhaps Golding had it all wrong. As humans, we're at our best when we try to work through difficult circumstances together.
最后第三部分我们看到单字 ordeal 这个字是名词，指严峻的考验、折磨。例如 After a week-long ordeal in the swamps of Florida, the researchers decided to give up and go home. 经过长达1周在佛罗里达沼泽区的艰苦工作，研究人员决定放弃，打道回府。或是 A yearly flooding in this region is one ordeal that the people here must put up with. 每年此地区的洪患是当地居民必须忍受的磨难。另外补充一个相关片语 go through or undergo an ordeal 表示经历磨难。我们可以说 Peter had gone through the ordeal of depression last year. Peter 去年经历了忧郁症的磨难。
So the boys from Tonga were stuck on this island, the island of Ata, for 15 months. When they were rescued at last after 15 months, the boys were in excellent physical and mental health despite their long ordeal. So unlike the boys in the novel who had reduced themselves to a savage state and they were hungry and they were probably sick and they resembled savage animals, these boys were fine. They were fine physically, mentally. They had no diseases. They weren't suffering from any mental issues, even though they had been stuck on that island for so long.
Yep, it was quite an ordeal, which means a very difficult situation. You might experience a difficult ordeal if you try to study overseas for the first time. You'll be in a country that you're not used to. You might suffer culture shock. So yes, it might be an ordeal for you. But still, these boys were able to survive this difficult ordeal. And as this real-life Lord of the Flies shows, perhaps Golding had it all wrong. Okay, so indeed, this is an example of how this could actually work out. In Golding's novel, of course, it had a more pessimistic ending where the boys were not able to survive, whereas the boys here from Tonga were able to survive. I should be fair here, though, because the English boys were stranded on a South Pacific island. But these boys from Tonga are used to these circumstances, so maybe that's why they survived where the English failed. I suppose if the English boys were stranded on one of the Orkney Islands off of Scotland or something, they would have survived too.
Right. So despite all of these differences and some of the similarities, we're glad that this story of the boys from Tonga made it into the news recently because it tells us that human nature isn't actually as ugly as Golding had thought it was. In fact, humans actually work better when they're faced with a difficult situation because that is when they come together and they work towards the welfare of the entire group. They're not selfish and there's hope for humanity at last.
That's very optimistic there. So it's nice that this really happened, that, yes, people can survive in a difficult situation and not turn on each other and not try to kill each other as they did in Sir William Golding's novel, again, Lord of the Flies from 1954. So as humans, we're at our best when we try to work through difficult circumstances together. And here we've got the word circumstances. It could be singular, circumstance, but oftentimes it's in the plural if we talk about a different kind of situation or a very specific kind of condition or situation. So yes, according to circumstances, I could say, well, I wanted to stay in Taiwan, but because of circumstances, I had to leave. I had an illness in my family or my visa ran out or whatever. So these are different kinds of circumstances that made me leave Taiwan. That, of course, is just an example.
Right. Or I could say, for instance, an outdoor sporting event can't happen if the weather turns bad. Under those circumstances, the event might be canceled and people will have to get their tickets back.
Okay, so there you have it. There's still cause for optimism here. Let's keep a smile on our faces and hope everything turns out in the end. Right now, we're going to listen once again to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文一开始写到，在1966年6名少年有一天决定搭帆船前往海上冒险，不过当暴风雨来袭时， Their adventure turned into a nightmare. 他们的冒险旅程成了一场噩梦。好，这边 turn into 就是表达变成，我们来学它的相关用法。好，第一种是用 A turn into B 或者是 A turn to B 来表达 A 变成 B。 那么 turn 在这边是不及物动词。举例来说， The argument turned into a physical fight. 那场争执变成了肢体冲突。 Water turns to ice at 0 degrees Celsius. 水在摄氏0度时变成冰。好，第二个用法 turn A into B或者是 turn A to B 是表达将 A 变成 B， 那么 turn 在这边是当及物动词哦。例如 The witch turned the princess into a squirrel. 女巫把公主变成松鼠了。好，那这样的句型也可以用被动语态 A be turned into B 或者是 A be turned to B 来表达。例如 The garage was turned into a studio apartment. 车库被改成一间套房了。好，那么课文接着写到说，这几位少年啊，随着海流漂流了好几天，直到最后意外发现一座无人居住的小岛。好，文中它是用到片语 come across。好，我们来学习它的不同用法。第一种呢 come across 可以当及物用，来表达说碰见、巧遇、偶然发现。像文中就是表达说意外发现一座无人居住的小岛，它用 come across 来表达偶然发现的语义。这时候 come across 其实就跟 bump into, run into, run across, come upon 等等相同，后面可以接人或是事物。例如 He came across an old friend on his way home. 他在回家途中碰巧遇见一位老朋友。We came across a lovely cafe a few days ago. 我们前几天偶然发现一间相当宜人的小餐馆。好，第二个用法 come across 可以当不及物用，来表达使产生什么样的印象，后面可以接 as 加上名词或形容词，来表达说给人怎么样的印象或感觉，表现得怎么样怎么样。例如 She came across as a very intelligent person. 她给人的印象是个非常聪明的人。那我们也可以在 come across 后面接 negatively 或者是 well 等等的副词来修饰。像 He came across badly during the interview. 在面试过程中，他给人的印象很差。好，第三个用法 come across 当不及物用，还可以指说像是某个想法被清楚表达或是了解的语义。例如 His passion really came across when he talked about his job. 当他在聊他的工作时，可以看得出他的热忱，也就是说他讲话的方式清楚表达了他对这个工作的热情，我们可以清楚了解到这样的状况。好，那么以上今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Adventure. Marilla wanted an adventure, so she decided to travel around Europe. Nightmare. Marilla's adventure turned into a nightmare when she lost her money and passport. Current. I put a paper ship in the river, and the current carried it away. Chore. Brian's mother makes him do some chores around the house, such as washing the dishes. Significantly. Significantly, James decided not to enter his father's law firm after graduating. Circumstance. The school allows students to use their cell phones only in certain circumstances.
Discussion Starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter for today, and the question is, do you think Golding had the wrong idea about human nature? Why or why not?
Well, I think Golding was wrong about human nature because, as the story of the 16 boys from Tonga shows, human nature isn't as bad as Golding had thought it was.
Well, I don't think human nature is as bad as Golding portrayed in his novel because every time I get together with my Taiwanese friends, you get about 7 or 8 of them, and they have a nice meal, and then they start drinking, and they have a really, really good time, and they don't have any arguments. So yeah, I think Golding got it all wrong. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.